When you think of crime, art theft is not usually the first thing that comes to your mind. But what if I was to tell you that art theft is a $4 to $6 billion industry worldwide? When a former business executive turned mystery writer becomes passionate about trying to find the missing art of one of the prolific artists of our time, she writes a fabulous book and she starts her investigative journey. Join me as I talk to author Joan Baker on this episode of True Crime and Authors.
Welcome to True Crime and Authors Podcast, where we bring two passions together. The show that gives new meaning to the old adage, truth is stranger than fiction. Here's your host, David McClam.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of True Crime and Authors. Of course, I am your man, David McClam. Hey, if you haven't already, make sure you follow us on all of our social medias. One link to a link tree in the show notes will get you to every link you need to have for the show. If you have been following the show or paying attention to your calendars, then you do know it is time for another author interview. And I know for a fact I have a good one for you today. Let me tell you about who our author is. She is a former business executive turned mystery writer. Her passion is researching and writing about weird mysteries and forgotten histories. She is the author of Chasing Picasso, the true story of a daytime heist on Art Hill. Please welcome Joan Baker. Hey, Joan, thank you for joining me today.
Hey, thank you for having me. So for those of you who don't know what Art Hill is this big sled riding hill that sits in front of the St. Louis Art Museum. So it's very well known around here. When it snows in St. Louis, everybody heads to Art Hill to break an arm or a leg, flying down the icy surface and hopefully not crash into the cemented pond that's right after you hit the bottom of the hill.
And that's good to know because I did not know where it was.
Yeah, well, when I wrote the book, it was definitely for a St. Louis audience originally who knows Art Hill, but in this, everybody knows Picasso's from that sense, anytime a stolen Picasso story's out there, it really does extend just the local area.
So before we begin talking about your fabulous book, what else can you tell us about Joan Baker that we don't already know?
Well, let's see. I started this journey back in 2018. I had left my former job. I had reached the point that I wanted a new career. I was done being in the corporate world. I decided to do writing. I took a good 6 months off before I did some business consulting on the side. And when I wanted to write, sit down and write, nothing would come out of my hands, my mind, except for business information. And I was like, I do not want to write about marketing at this point in time in my life. I've done it in my entire career. I did not want to write about the industry I was in. I did not want to write about acquisitions and mergers and organizational takeovers and all the things that have an effect on employees in a business. So I actually shelved this writing idea for about a year, and I picked up a treasure hunting book just to get my mind off of writing and onto something else. And I was looking for a local piece of art buried, possibly in St. Louis area, from an old book that was written in 1982. And it was, by all accounts, a failure. It didn't sell a lot. So a lot of these treasures were never uncovered. So in that process, I began researching history and that of the area. Now, I'd done some history research before for genealogy work that I've done in the past for my family. But I had a couple Google word searches. I was looking for something, and what popped up was the story of art. And it was a more recent story, one of which I cover in the book, about a piece of art stolen from a local area that ends up in Steven Spielberg's hands. And I was thinking, wow, art theft, that's interesting. So I went back to old newspaper archives and I found a story of art thefts in 78. And then I kept going back further. And then I landed on wait, we had a Picasso stolen? I don't remember this. Now, I grew up in the city of St. Louis, and in the 70s, I was just a kid, so I wouldn't remember everything. And I certainly wasn't paying attention to art when I was that age. But I thought it was interesting that I never came across anything where this crime was ever solved. So I my first thought was that, I found a lot of interesting history about St. Louis that people do not know. There is some weird stuff here. And maybe I'll write these short story books about it. But as I dug into the art story, it became so fascinated that it became the story. This Picasso became the story because I started to learn about art thefts going back to World War II, not just the stuff of the subject of the Monuments Men, if you remember that book, or if you watched the movie, was about the art that Hitler stole and stored away and that they recovered. But if you go back to when Hitler took power, he actually began stealing art from his own museums, along with collectors, and mainly Jewish collectors, and stripping them of their art. And a lot of it that was modern art, he hated. He hated modern art. He thought he called it degenerate art. He thought those artists were of a degenerate mind. He didn't care whether they were German artists or not. If you were modern art, he didn't like you, and that was it. And so they began selling this art off in international auctions. And really, when you think about it, those art sales more than likely helped fund the war machine that started a few years later. So a lot of modern art that came to the United States during this period is a subject of it's a red flag period. And a lot of the museums have these provenance projects that they're required to research the transactions of art between 1933 and 1945. And that's because that's the period Hitler was in power in the time art was being stolen. And so the point of the transactions really is to be very upfront about where the art came from, because the rules around art and the international laws regarding what happened during that period are different than typical stolen art. So I had went down this path because this painting came to the museum in 1934, and I was thinking, okay, it came during that period. Is it possible that it was stolen art and the museum didn't know it? And if you read the story of the book and what I found out about the book, I didn't find stolen art from Hitler, but what I found was actually even more bizarre and interesting. But it gave me this whole education about art I did not know, and I find fascinating. So I don't think you have to be a lover of art at all to have your mind blown by what this history of art and art theft and how it evolved into a criminal activity over the years. So I think if you learn about that and want to read a good story, and I tried to tell a story not in a history lesson, but through the demonstration of stolen art. Because if you went to your art museum, I'm sure you'd find some fascinating back-end stories, but they're usually hidden in the little placards, or you got to go online to find the information. But there's some great stories, some of it more interesting than the art, I feel.
No, even though we know what happens, when you think about mainstream crime, you never really think about art theft being in that. You share this with me and what you share with the audience. What is the percentage of art theft that there really is out there in mainstream crime?
Well, the third largest criminal trade in the world is art. And it is a $6 to $8 billion a year problem. This is worldwide. And this has been going on, as I learned, started in the late 60s. So by the time this Picasso was stolen in 1973, it was already going up in the third criminal largest trade. But back then, the investigators really didn't understand what was happening with art. They had gone through all these theories, but they just didn't know where the art was going. I mean, the United States did not have a dedicated art team like you had in Italy or France, but most of the world's greatest art came out of Europe. So reasonably so, that's why they're far ahead in that world. There was also other things going on at the same time. Art was one of the highest investments you could make. in the 60s. And the post-World War II, art was one of the best investments you can make in terms of your return. I mean, you could get 2,000% return. And part of this had to do with this sudden demand for art that occurred after World War II. And I think this was a response into Hitler's determination to get rid of modern art. But it was also a response to what was changing in art auctions or in just auctions alone. So you had these big auctions houses that would sell art, and they had sold art for a long time. But what changed in the late 50s was they made it a celebrity event and it became real popular. And then all of a sudden, the value of art started growing tremendously through these auctions. And part of it was psychology, is what I learned, and how people respond to bidding. But you also had these egos involved now and a lot of wealthy people involved in bidding this art. And so someone's art could be sold for a tremendous amount of money, which would in effect make the rest of their art very much worth a lot of money, even though that artist may have sold that piece of art for hardly anything at the time. It essentially made all their other art valuable. So once it became so big, I think criminals looked at this and said, well, wait a minute. Most art is not secure, especially in Europe. You could go into a hotel where there was former artists that stayed at and left art. They would basically exchange art for maybe a meal back then. They would steal art from places that were just not secure. Even the schemes evolved. They used to be ransom schemes or insurance schemes, and then they start changing, and art really became this international currency. And because it became that, what I notice is that organized crime, even through Europe and then the United States, when pressure was put on organized crime, specifically groups like the mafia, there became an increase in art thefts. And it really wasn't until the late 70s that a detective I think he was out of New York, he theorized that art was likely being stolen by organized crime in order to facilitate transactions where money would normally be used. And this would help hide those transactions. So when we go back to the 70s, and we start to look what was happening in those period, organized crime was under a lot of pressure by the U.S. government, but there was also a major narcotics, heroin trade going on. And so I think all of this contributed to art being the target of theft. And a lot of the art evolved very quickly to targeting well-known artists, but lesser-known pieces, because they could be hidden, they were forgotten very quickly, they could be moved easily to another market, even within the United States, and sold to another buyer, because you still also had the demand of art as well, right? So you had more people also buying art at the same time. And so there's really two big possible markets. It was organized crime and just the open market, just because you could move art to another location and sell it. There was no art theft database. You think about communications back then, there was no national news. There was really nothing that would bind these cities together to talk about art thefts. It might show up in the newspaper, but in the case of this particular Picasso, it was stolen 3 days after Picasso died. So really, the stories of Picasso that were in the newspaper at the time were about his death and his estate and that sort of thing. And so the story of this particular art died fairly quickly.
Can you tell us where, when, and why the theft took place?
Sure. So the theft took place on April 11th, 1973. And like I said, it was 3 days after Picasso died. It took place at the St. Louis Art Museum, which back then was known as the City Art Museum of St. Louis. In 1970s wasn't a great time for U.S. parks and city-owned museums where they were pretty much ran by tax benefits. You have to think about there was just a lot of graffiti and things happening at the parks. They weren't being taken care of. Things were run down, and even the museums were struggling. This museum was particularly struggling at the time. And so over the years, the museum had changed. It was a beautiful museum built at the 1904 World's Fair to protect art that was going to be displayed at the fair. And over the years, it had a lot of alterations in terms of it got a lot of art, but it had to find new ways of displaying it. Skylights had began to deteriorate. The museum itself wasn't in great shape. There was only in this museum 2 entrances and exits at the time. Even the museum was built with more than those. They were blocked off because the museum was desperate for space to display their growing collection. So you could only enter the museum from Art Hill, or you had to go through an auditorium that was added on in the 60s through the back, which would not have been a convenient way to get to the museum's lobby and art, because that was really off that main entrance. So what happened was somewhere between 4 and 4:45, someone walked out with this small Picasso. The painting is about the size of a legal letter size piece of paper. It was painted on wood, so it couldn't be rolled up. It was fastened to a partition wall. There was a partition. Again, they made an alcove into a space, art gallery space, and it was hanging on this wall. And it walked away. And, you didn't have devices, alarm systems on the wall that would notify someone that someone was pulling art off the wall. All those things exist today. You can't even cross a line without a beam going off or a noise going off. But back then that didn't exist. And that was true for most museums, and why art was such a big target. So the piece was taken, and that day one of the art curators was leaving the museum. She was sick, and she would cut through this area of the museum to leave on her way out. And she noticed that, wait a minute, that piece of art's missing from the wall. And normally when the museum staff would take something from the wall for repairs, they would leave a tag hanging up. And there was no tag. So she was right to be concerned. And she made necessary contacts within the museum to see if it had been relocated, and meanwhile had the security guards secure all the entrances. Now they searched the museum for 2 days and didn't find it. And finally, they had to go to the police and say, on Friday the 13th, this art's missing. Them waiting 2 days was not unusual. This happened also at the Met. First there's an embarrassment of an art theft, right? Because art museums, a lot of their art are things they acquired through financial donations, and some art is actually donated, some is on loan. So it's a scary thing for them to go out and admit that, we had a piece of art stolen, because that puts everybody on edge. So that delay, though, I think hurt the investigation, because if it was an inside job, which was commonly thought that most thefts that occurred in the museum were somehow inside jobs. Not all proved to be the true, but if you think about the amount of security they had, it would make sense that you would think that, but that means it would be 2 days. The investigators would be talking to people 2 days after the theft, 2 days for people to get their story straight, 2 days for people to, get their act together or whatever. So the story comes out, and at the same time, like I said, there was a lot of stories coming out about Picasso and the funeral and things like that. So it kind of got buried. But the theories of stolen art were still the same theories they had from the 60s. Some of these theories, one was called the Dr. No theory, is what they call it today. But back then it was a real theory that most art was stolen by wealthy collectors, that they hired somebody to steal the art, which turned out to be really not true. But that perception was really built on the James Bond movie in 1962, the movie Dr. No. And in the movie, they show a Goya painting that was stolen at that same period. And it was kind of a joke, but that joke really became a public perception of who steals art, when really the everyday criminal, or not the everyday criminal, but someone who at least has the ability to move art into a fencing operation or something similar to that, or is the kind of people that steal art. It's not, what's the other one? The Thomas Crown Affair is another one. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, but it's this rich guy, and it's nothing like that in it. And you don't hear about art, a lot of weapons and guns being brought out in art thefts. A lot of times they're very, I guess, clandestine would be the way to put it. But those criminals, it's not that they're not dangerous. They are. And you see that in these stories behind art, how dangerous these criminals can really be to get art. It just doesn't come through when an art theft happens, maybe. So at the time, this was not a priority for any investigator. If you live in a crime where you've got narcotics, bombs, you got people being murdered, and you're a police officer, you don't make a lot of money anyways. You're taxed with handling these other things, and somebody's asking you to investigate an art theft, especially if it was a personal collection of some rich guy, they probably didn't have a lot of sympathy for him. So I think, and a lot of times they were insured, so it was like, file your insurance and whatever. In the case of a museum theft, those were usually investigated because the museums and really the art belonged to the people of St. Louis because the taxpayers fund the museum. But still, you didn't have art teams. The art theft was growing at a double-digit rate. It was out of control, but there was no dedicated art teams. There was one guy from the FBI in D.C. who was dedicated to art, but he had to investigate all art across the U.S. So you couldn't do it without some local help. But in the sense of 1970s, the laws for property theft, all those things were really in the favor of the criminal. So I really learned that in this process, it was just a period ripe for art thefts. And a lot of it happened. And those art, once they went into especially if they went into the black market where they're exchanged and used as barter, they pretty much seem to stay there. I mean, you still have tens of thousands of pieces of art, they say, that are still from World War II. They're in what they call the gray markets. And occasionally you hear stories of maybe someone who passed on and they found a bunch of art in their location because it was given to them by their father, who was a Nazi, officer or whatever. So those stories do come about these days. But people find them in antique stores, or they show up for sale again because people forgot they were stolen.
What actual Picasso painting was stolen?
Oh, well, that's a good question. So this Picasso painting was called A Kneeling Woman Combing, or A Study of a Kneeling Woman Combing Her Hair. It actually had multiple names, which turned out to be another problem with this painting. It had like 5 names. And in the newspaper, when it was stolen, they just called it Nude. Now, if you can't think of a more generic name for a painting than Nude, right? If you ever go through an art book, everybody has every artist back then would have 20 nudes. So it was the most nondescript name for a piece of art. And it managed to elude even Picasso's own catalogs that he worked with a man named Christian Versos to catalog all of his pieces. And it eluded every catalog from the time they started 2 years before the painting was even sold to the museum, all the way up into the 60s. It finally got in the catalog. And it was a black and white oil painting. And if you only saw it, you would think it was a drawing, because that's what it looks like. In the newspaper, I thought it was a drawing, but it's really a black and white painting. And there's 2 actual drawings and a sculpture that combined with this painting for a study Picasso did. Picasso was only in his 20s. He wasn't even famous. And this is right before his Cubism period. It was the end of his Rose period, going into his Cubism period. And this Cubism period is when he really took off and became a well-known figure. So the story even behind the painting, and the figure is his former lover, Fernando Olivier. And when you learn the story of the painting, of the period in which he painted, you understand Picasso was a poor man. He died a very wealthy man, but he was poor then, a struggling artist, and he painted in a Rose period and it had no red in it. So the painting itself is rare in a lot of ways. And it's probably worth, I figured, if you took what it was growing as back then and if it held true today, it would probably be worth over 30 million easily.
So I'll ask you this question after I tell you this quick story, because when I was reading your book, this came to mind. So I'm a huge WWE fan, professional wrestling. 2 years ago, WWE started a show called WWE Most Wanted Treasures. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to get back memorabilia of things that some of these iconic wrestlers wore or used throughout the period, because now they want them back because they're valuable. And some of the things, even though I've watched WWE now for well over 40 years, you watch these guys wrestling these things, you're like, yeah, that's not going to be worth anything down the line. The story that sparked me thinking about your book was Bret Hart. They recently did an episode with Bret Hart. They were trying to get back his iconic jacket that he wore in his first WrestleMania. And they always go to the wrestler first and say, do you have any leads on this? And he says, I don't know, because this jacket was stolen from me at the hotel that night. He goes, I showed up with it, I wrestled in it, I changed out of it, and then the next thing I know, it's gone. So they send this team of people out to see if they can find this jacket. They actually did find it, but of course it wasn't from the person that stole it. The story went that somebody that owned the hotel then stole the jacket. A person got sick, needed money, so their family sold the jacket to the next person. And when you get these things, they're very rare, so they're making these outrageous deals because they do put a price tag on it. And they were willing to pay up to $60,000 for this jacket. Yeah. And the guy's like, it's really important to me, but because they were going to give it back to Bret at the end of them showing it off, and that's the whole reason they wanted. They want to take it to fan events so that fans can relive it. But he did relinquish that to them. Is there a set of people like that goes out looking for these lost and stolen paintings in the art world?
I think so. I think you have people who look for, especially in flea markets and antique stores, I think you have people that have an eye for things that are worth money. There was a story recently of a woman who had recovered 2 dishes, and she saw them for $8 at the store. Now, she was an interior designer, and she recognized the art as Picasso, and she saw them on the back side. So she paid the $8, took them home, and found out each one was worth $10,000. We talk about a great deal, right? So I think in the case of art, I encourage people in the book, hey, you know what? Look in your attic. Maybe you bought a home where somebody had stolen and they put it in their attic, because you don't know. It could have been organized crime, but at the same time, it could have been someone who was so overwhelmed by Picasso's death, they decided to steal a piece of the master. And if that's the case, it could still be local. So I think it's a great idea to look, but really anywhere you should look, because it was so unknown. The painting should have made it to the art theft database in 1979, and it did not. I don't know what happened. I think it was just an error. So you could have bought it and never known how much money it was worth. You don't know if the signature of Picasso has been covered up. It may or may have not been. But there are definitely people who go out, I think, and look for stolen art. Now, I think if you're like me, you're just kind of interested. I was just interested in what happened to this painting, and it opened me up to this fascinating world that was going on that I never knew about, and a lot of local history that I never knew about. But I wouldn't recommend going out and trying to negotiate with criminals or going undercover into the black market to find a piece of art. I mean, that's really for professionals. And there are professional agents who that's exactly what they do. But I think a great adventure is next time you go to an antique store or somewhere like that, go shopping and check it out, because people have found great deals, and it really, a lot of people pass it up because they just don't have the knowledge of whatever it is they're looking for. So I would bet there's people out there for sure looking.
So in the rare occasion that somebody may find this, say in their attic at an art sale, what should they do if they discover that this is actually the one?
Well, my recommendation is I'd call a lawyer, only because, if you're going to try to sell something and find out that you can't, because the United States law for this would be, at least my understanding, when I was writing the book, I asked about this, and my understanding is, generally speaking, if art, you cannot pass good title on stolen art. And so even if you were a good faith purchaser, you inherited, and that person had bought it and nobody had any idea who stole it, it doesn't matter. It cannot pass title. However, I have came across some cases in which one was with involving Georgia O'Keeffe. She had art taken from her apartment. Georgia O'Keeffe was a artist herself and painted lilies and that. And art had been stolen from her apartment or something, and she had saw it years later. She kind of thought she knew who had it, but I don't think they went after to try to recover it until much later. And the court said, well, you never showed any effort to go after this earlier. And so they ruled actually in favor of the person who had it. And the person didn't steal it, but they must have purchased it from someone they did. So I don't think the law might be as clear, because we're talking about a case in 1973. I know, and And technically, the insurance company paid the museum a reimbursed for a value amount, wasn't the actual market value. That was a whole other story because they didn't update their insurance policy, but they did get the full value anyways, but they would really have the title rights, insurance company would. Now, most cases when art is stolen from a museum or any really a personal somebody and it can be recovered, usually the money is returned to the insurance company and the person gets their art back. So I think it's a little bit of a gray area, but I would definitely call a lawyer and say, look, I found this, it's worth money and all that, well, what can I do with it? Now, if you live in like Italy or France, this is surprising to me, but they have good faith purchaser laws. So if you bought it under good faith, you own it. And in fact, in France, I think it is, if you want it back, you're going to have to pay them for whatever they paid for it.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, I thought that was a little bizarre, but, I guess because they've had so much art pilfered, I don't know, it just seems like a strange law to have there. And the laws are different for even if it was something stolen from World War II in that period, the law is different. Like, there is no good faith purchaser law unless it came out of the museum or like you were complacent in the sympathetic to the Nazis or, like that's why anything stolen from a German museum by the German Nazis is a legitimate transaction because they did it, their own government, it was their own deal.
So after all this time, it's been 49 years with you writing this fabulous book. If you had to guess, where would you think the painting is?
Well, I really think that it was probably fenced. We had multiple, turns out we had multiple fencing operations, and I talk about that in the book. I think it was probably fenced to another location and sold to somebody who probably didn't know it was stolen because it was so easy to do. And we have evidence of that happening. Another painting was stolen 2 months after a Rockwell was stolen from a local gallery, and that ended up in the hands of Steven Spielberg. And he had got it from a dealer who bought it legitimately at an auction in New Orleans, and the title had been cleared. So unfortunately, the FBI had made an error, and they still listed it as stolen. And so that led to the guy who originally owned it. It was a lawsuit. Another story I talk about in the book because and it ends up having some connections to the other art thefts. That's why I said when I started down this path, I never realized what a crazy story I would find all along the way. But I really think it had to do with, if not organized crime, a theft that was definitely associated with the fencing operation that moved into another market. So I think it's in somebody's possession in the United States somewhere, and they don't know what they have.
Which is common because, just watching WB Most Wanted Treasures, I watch some things on art, I watch things on baseball cards, and people sitting there going, man, this guy sold me this for like $200 and didn't realize they had a $40,000 card. So basic consumers, we don't know.
Yeah. Well, when you were talking earlier about off the air, when we were talking about the art theft, there was a Netflix movie about the art theft, the Boston Museum, the Gardner Museum, which was very interesting. And the heist itself was very fascinating. These two guys go in disguised as Boston police officers on St. Patty's Day and basically rip the place apart for art, and it's never been seen again. This heist, if you just look at from a story of a heist, it's not very exciting, right? Somebody walked out during the day of this museum. But if you go, once I dove into the story and understood what was happening, that started about this time and then ended in 78, at least in St. Louis, that my mind was just blown away. And one of the things that blew me away was the revelation of an FBI file. When I went to look for information on stolen art, the FBI had really destroyed all their files about these cases. So did the city. They had gotten rid of the cases, and mainly because it's been 50 years, they purged them, they don't need it. But I found a file under the JFK archives, under the assassination files, and really it was a sub-archive of the Martin Luther King assassination, where there was an informant file under there that had a lead into what was later called the St. Louis conspiracies to kill Martin Luther King. In 1978, there was a commission that looked at whether or not the assassination of JFK and Martin Luther King were sole assassins or if there was conspirators. And so they were looking into this. And it just so happened that in 1978, the last art theft museum revealed a informant file which involved one of the suspects in the art crime, where he had told an informant he had once been offered money to kill Martin Luther King. And this was between 66 and 1967. And so Martin Luther King was killed in 1968. And James O'Ray was from the St. Louis metro area. I don't know if anybody knows it, but James O'Ray, of course, is the one who was in prison for assassinating Martin Luther King. And he had pled guilty in the first 3 days. After 3 days, he tried to undo his plea, claiming that he was set up. He was a patsy. He was all the things that criminals like to do once they're in jail. But he was local to St. Louis, and he was in the Missouri State Pen. He was there because he robbed a Kroger in St. Louis. And so when I came across the story, I was like, I have never heard of this, but it was, if you went to the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee, which is, by the way, blew my mind away there, because you're literally standing, it's the Lorraine Hotel, and you're standing in front of, it still looks like as it did back then, except for the inside of the museum. But they have all the conspiracies on the wall, and there, the first one is the St. Louis conspiracies, and all that came out because of the art theft. Had the art theft not happened, they would have never found this file, because this file, apparently, when the FBI agent wrote it, he misspelled the guy's name, and it was not filed with the criminal's normal records. And so they caught it because the informant they were looking into at the time, because they thought these guys were working together, and that's when it came out. And so that is a whole other rabbit hole. You just, when you get to it, I know you haven't got to it yet, but it'll blow your mind. And I would have loved to spend more time on it, but I think it has to be a book in itself, because it's the web. It's like a spider web of characters in St. Louis. I never even knew St. Louis was an organized crime city when I grew up. I had no idea. And then I learned it was, a fairly big one. So was Kansas City, and I learned about all the corruption, and I was like, no wonder why my mom was always worried about us playing in the streets.
Well, speaking of museums, I haven't gotten a chance yet. That is on my list for sure, is to go to that museum down there. But I have been, I don't know if you've ever been to the Museum of Tolerance. I tell everybody they have to at least go once. It is a Jewish museum, but when you walk in, the first thing it starts talking about is all of the hate in the world and things of that nature. The whole experience ends, though, where they're actually walking you through the actual Holocaust. So, they've replicated the gas chambers, even way down to how it was split, men, women. They give you cards of an individual person, and your goal is to figure out if that person survived or lived at the end of it. Wow. They actually do have Holocaust survivors that are still alive that come on certain days, and they actually do give talks. But when you said like you were sitting in the Lorraine Hotel, which I've done a study on that, I know it is, and there's exactly like he left it, is almost like you are sitting in what they went through, and you can feel it. And they play this movie on the wall, how it went. And by the time you're out of there, if you are not a better person, or if you want to be don't want to be a better person, I don't know what you went there for, because that's what the whole museum is about.
Now, where's that located at?
So I know one's located here in LA, and I think that's the biggest one, because right across the street from that one, they have an expose for Anne Frank, which is a whole separate experience. So if you ever get a chance to come down here, you should check that out. That
sounds pretty cool. Not cool, but cool to go see. I like living history. I think there's, when you're a kid and you're in school and you learn history, I can't tell you how many times I slept in history class. But until you really start research your history yourself, you really start to appreciate, especially I think when I really start to appreciate history when I start studying my genealogy and understanding where my family came from. because I could see their struggles. And I think, God, we are so blessed what we had today. Even when we were kids and we were poor, we were not as poor as, my great grandparents who came here. And it was just, you start to appreciate, I think, things more in the past. And you understand why history is important. When I was a kid, I could never understand, why do I got to learn this history lesson? I mean, isn't it about tomorrow, blah, blah, blah. And now I was like, oh my gosh, you have to know history. And I think one of the best ways to learn history too is to go out and visit places, the places that things happened at, even though they look different today. To stand where somebody else stood in an important moment in time is fantastic. And I'd say another really good museum to go see was the World War II Museum in New Orleans. That is a great museum, a great education through that museum about the war. And it's interesting. It's just far more interesting to learn history that way than reading a 10-inch book that mostly skips over the good details, by the way. All the things you want to learn that you really don't realize aren't usually in the history books is what I've learned now at my older age, that the really, really good stuff you got to dig for. And that's the stuff that's fascinating.
So if someone out there somehow knows any information about the missing Picasso, where can they submit that information to?
Go to chasingpicasso.com. I have a lead form on the site. They can submit it there. They can submit it anonymously. If they know about the painting, have ever seen the painting, or have got a story to share, just submit it. I'm trying to keep up to date on what's going on. It's going to take some time, I think, to spread the story outside of St. Louis and get it to other places, because it is just me working this story. But I think it happens to be a story that you could read it 10 years from now, and I think you would still be fascinated by all the things that the book has. So at some point in time, I would love to see somebody say that they have it. That would be great. I don't know what's going to happen for a while, but I think that would be fantastic. That would be very satisfying. And I don't think art thefts, I guess, I don't know what goes on exactly these days and what everybody is stealing, because I feel like it's a $6 to $8 billion criminal trade every year. I mean, what are they continually going to take? I feel like everything's been pilfered already, but I guess not. Maybe they keep exchanging things, I suppose. I know private collections get hit more than any museum anyway, so maybe that's why we don't really hear it. We only hear the end number. That, but so something, go home, check your attics, look for art, go to a garage sale. I mean, I say when you're out looking, no, it doesn't hurt to look to see that signature. Picasso's got a distinct signature, so learn it and see if you can find it. He made over 100,000 pieces of art in his lifetime, most prolific artist. But he's also the most stolen. So there's still over 1,100 pieces of art of his that has been stolen. So there's big possibilities. Find a piece of Picasso out there in the market.
So after writing this fabulous book, what is next, and what can we expect from C. Joan Baker in the future?
I've tossed around a few ideas, and I think the one that stands out to the most that it never left me is understanding the St. Louis conspiracy that went around in 78. So I'm thinking we have the 50th anniversary of the hearings coming up in 5 years, which would be also the 60th anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination. And I think I would like to dig further into it, because I think people kind of blew off these conspiracies as something that, and it's very well possible, by the way, but they blew them off as something to throw out there. So it took the heat off the FBI, which could be absolutely true. However, there's a lot of connections, local connections, especially to James O. Ray, that I can't help but think that, maybe there's something to it. So I think people would be interested in at least hearing more about the story. There's no way we would find answers to it, I think, now, but just knowing the small connections, and I don't know, I think if people knew about it, I think they would just be blown away. I mean, because there's stories you don't hear.
Right.
Right. So I think that's probably next.
In closing, is there anything you'd like to say to any of your readers or fans that could be listening today?
Sure. If you're interested in buying a book, you can buy it pretty much for any bookstore online. You might be able to go to your local from your local bookstore, but pretty much anywhere online they're available. It's also available in ebook, and my own website, which is cjoanbaker.com, and Chasing Picasso. On both sites, I have books for sale, signed books. And so if you're interested in getting a signed book from me, you have to order it directly from me, obviously. But any of those sites you can get the book at. And so every time somebody reads it, that's one more person that can share the story and possibly help bring the painting back to the museum.
Well, Joan, it has been an enlightening conversation. I thank you for coming on the show. I've learned a lot about this. I am finishing up your book right now, so I encourage everybody to go out and read that. It is excellent what I've learned so far. So that's why I do this podcast, to learn new things and get these fabulous books out there. Anytime that you want to come back, you know how to get a hold of me. Let me know and we can make that happen.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it. It was a great conversation. Very relaxing. I'd love and have to do it again. And maybe next time I can come back with a location of a painting. That would be great.
Sounds good. All right, everybody, that was the wonderful Joan Baker. You can get your own copy of Chasing Picasso, the true story of a daytime heist, on Art Hill at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and many other fine book retailers. You can also get it as part of your Kindle Unlimited subscription. And if you have that, you absolutely have no reason not to read this book because it's free to you under your $9.99 subscription rate. Also remember, Joan does not get paid on anything you get from KU unless you are turning the pages. Downloading it is not enough, so please make sure you are reading the book. Also, if you do have any information on the missing Picasso painting, go over to chasingpicasso.com. At the bottom, you will see a link for Leave a Lead. Please do so. And if you want to know more about Joan, you can go to her website, cjoanbaker.com. She will be going back on book tours. If you want to meet her and you're in the area, that's where you can find out all that information, as well as my website, truecrimeandauthors.com. All information will also be there. All right, guys, once again, I thank you for tuning in. You have many, many choices in true crime and book podcasts. I'm grateful that you tune in with me. Be safe. Always remember, always stay humble. An act of kindness can make someone's day. A little love and compassion can go a long way. And this is the podcast where two passions becomes one. I'll catch you guys in the next one.
Thank you for listening to True Crime and Authors. Don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe. Join us on social media. On Facebook at True Crime and Authors. On Twitter at Authors True. On YouTube and TikTok at True Crime and Authors. And email at truecrimeandauthors@gmail.com. Cover art and logo designed by Dazzling_Ray from Fiverr. Sound mixing and editing by David McClam. Intro script by Sophie Wild from Fiverr. And I'm the voice guy, your imaging guy from Fiverr. See you next time on True Crime and Authors.